Mike had always believed that hard work could get him through anything, but when his engineering job disappeared overnight, so did his sense of security. The bills piled up, the job applications led nowhere, and every trip to the grocery store felt like a losing battle against rising prices. Then, one evening, as he stared at the bare concrete of his driveway, an idea took root. Why let the space sit empty when it could feed him? Armed with determination and a handful of old wooden pallets, Mike built his first raised garden bed. Tomatoes, zucchini, bell peppers. Each plant became a small victory in his fight to survive. His driveway transformed into a thriving oasis. Green vines stretched toward the sun, and fresh vegetables filled his kitchen. Neighbors would stop by, some curious, others inspired. Mrs. Gonzalez, the elderly woman from down the street, once traded a homemade pie for a few tomatoes. "Reminds me of the Victory Gardens we had back in the day," she said with a smile. But not everyone was pleased. One afternoon, as Mike wiped the dirt from his hands, a sleek, black SUV rolled to a stop in front of his house. The gold letters on the side read, HOA Enforcement. A woman stepped out, clipboard in hand, her expression as rigid as the rules she lived by. "Mr. Carter," she said, surveying his garden with barely concealed disdain. "This is unacceptable. This neighborhood has standards." Mike's stomach tightened. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. The woman introduced herself as Donna Reynolds, head of the HOA Enforcement Committee. She was the type of person who wore authority like a tailored suit. Every word clipped, every movement precise. "This vegetable patch," she gestured dismissively, "violates Section 123 of the HOA guidelines. All visible landscaping must be pre-approved." Mike took a breath, keeping his voice calm. "It's just a garden. It's feeding me while I look for work. How is that a problem?" Mrs. Reynolds gave a thin, practiced smile. "Aesthetics matter. Property values matter. And frankly, this looks like an overgrown mess." Mike clenched his jaw. Just behind her, he could see her own yard, a towering water fountain spilling over into a manicured lawn. Surely, she hadn't asked for approval on that. "You have 7 days to remove this," she said, snapping a photo with her phone, "or you'll face daily fines." As her car disappeared down the street, Mike's neighbor, Raj, wandered over from his porch. "She did the same thing to me last month," he muttered. "Tried to fine me for wind chimes. Said they were noise pollution." Mike exhaled sharply. "This is ridiculous. Half the neighborhood has gardens." "Not in their driveways," Raj pointed out. "And that's the key. They can't regulate what they can't see. You might have a real fight on your hands." Mike looked at his garden, his lifeline, and squared his shoulders. If they wanted to fight, he wouldn't back down. Determined to understand what he was up against, Mike spent the next day walking through Pinecrest Hills with his phone in hand. He documented everything. Unapproved basketball hoops, decorative flags that clearly violated HOA guidelines, lawn ornaments that weren't on any list, and most importantly, Mrs. Reynolds' massive water fountain. When he returned home, he dug out his HOA rule book. 3 years ago, it had been a short, straightforward document. The new version? 26 pages of restrictions, amendments, and vague wording. The rules weren't just strict. They were designed to be confusing. Late that evening, as he flipped through legal jargon, a realization hit him. The rules weren't meant to protect the neighborhood. They were meant to control it. Just then, headlights swept across his window. A car idled in front of his house. Mrs. Reynolds' husband's luxury sedan. Mike watched as the man spoke on the phone, occasionally gesturing toward the garden. Even through the glass, Mike caught a few chilling words. "Perfect location. After we clear them out." Mike's pulse pounded. This wasn't about landscaping. This was about something much bigger. The next morning, Mike took his findings to Raj. "I think they're targeting certain homes." Raj's face darkened. "You might be right. My cousin works for city planning. He told me Reynolds Development just filed papers for a zoning change. They want to turn part of Pinecrest Hills into a commercial district." Mike's breath caught. "They can't just tear down houses." "They don't have to," Raj said grimly. "They just need people to sell cheap, make life miserable, pile on fines. Suddenly, they own half the neighborhood, And boom, new development. Mike's hands curled into fists. So my garden isn't the problem. It's the excuse. That night, while watering his plants, he noticed a white envelope tucked into his fence. Inside was a $500 check and a handwritten note. For your garden. Don't let them win. No signature. No clue who sent it. Someone in the neighborhood wanted him to fight back. And he would. Point 5. Seeking strength and knowledge. With renewed determination, Mike spent hours researching property laws, HOA regulations, and county ordinances. And then he found it. County Ordinance 479. No homeowner association may restrict reasonable food cultivation during declared drought emergencies. He checked the county website. The drought emergency from last summer was still in effect. Mike's heart pounded. They had broken the law. Armed with this knowledge, he started preparing his case. He printed out copies of the ordinance, gathered photos, and just in time, because the HOA was about to make their next move. 3 days later, as he returned from a job interview, he saw them, 3 men in matching polo shirts. HOA enforcement. They weren't just inspecting. They were placing violation notices all over his property. Mike stormed toward them. What exactly do you think you're doing? Doug Peterson, a gruff-looking man with a military haircut, barely glanced up. Section 147. Aesthetic consistency requirements. Your garden exceeds the acceptable size limit. Mike's hands clenched. There's no rule about garden size. Doug smirked. New amendment, passed last month. He handed over a document. Mike scanned it. The date was today. They were making up rules just for him. Mrs. Reynolds watched smugly from her car. Mike met her gaze, refusing to back down, because now he had something she didn't, the law, and he was about to use it. The night was quiet, but something felt off. Mike had installed security cameras after the last HOA stunt, and now, staring at the screen, his stomach turned. 2 shadowy figures crept toward his garden. They weren't stealing vegetables. They were pouring something on his plants. Mike bolted outside, but by the time he reached the driveway, the figures were gone. A sharp, chemical scent clung to the air. His heart pounded as he knelt beside his tomatoes. The once lush leaves curled inward, already wilting. Panic twisted in his gut. He grabbed a handful of soil. It felt wrong, grainy, tainted. Something had poisoned his garden. By morning, half his plants were dead. His food source, his hard work, destroyed overnight. As Mike stood in the wreckage, a small slip of paper fluttered among the ruined leaves. Neat, perfect handwriting. Just 3 words. Follow the rules. His blood ran cold. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. It was war. That's not enforcement, Raj said, fury flashing his eyes. That's vandalism. Mike wasn't the only one outraged. Word spread fast. By noon, the neighborhood Facebook group was on fire. Posts poured in. HOA destroyed his food. This isn't right. Who's next? Then came the knock at his door. Mrs. Gonzalez, her silver hair pulled back, held out a basket. These seedlings should help, she said firmly. Behind her stood Tom and Sarah from Oak Street, carrying wood, soil, and fresh stakes. We read what happened, Sarah said. Tom's a carpenter. We'll help rebuild. Mike's living room filled with unexpected allies. Neighbors he barely knew arrived with supplies, legal advice, and most importantly, stories. An elderly man with shaking hands laid out documents. They fined me for installing a wheelchair ramp before my wife passed, he said, voice thick with emotion. Said it wasn't aesthetically consistent. I had to take it down while she was still alive. A quiet woman in the corner spoke up. They told me to remove my bird feeder. But Mrs. Reynolds has 3 in her yard. It wasn't just Mike. This was a pattern, a strategy, a power play. And the neighborhood was finally seeing it. By sunset, Mike's backyard looked like a command center. A map of the neighborhood covered his table, dotted with red X's, houses that had been fined, harassed, or forced to sell. We have proof of selective enforcement, Mrs. Patel, a paralegal, said. If we take this public, they'll have to answer for it. Mr. Abernathy, the quiet retired real estate agent, tapped the table. The real issue isn't the fines. It's the pattern. They create impossible rules, enforce them selectively, and pressure people to leave. Raj pulled up his laptop. "Look at this," he said, spinning the screen around. "These homes, all sold below market value in the last 6 months. And guess who the buyer was? Pinecrest Capital, LLC. Mike's stomach dropped. That's the company linked to the HOA president, Marcus Williams. "They're forcing people out," Sarah whispered, "and flipping the neighborhood for a fortune." Mike stared at the names, the numbers, the cold calculations that had uprooted lives. "We have to stop them." The final piece of the puzzle came the next night. Mrs. Gonzalez, her voice a whisper over the phone, sounded breathless. "Mijo, I heard something." She had managed to slip into Mrs. Reynolds' campaign donor event, posing as catering staff. "They're planning to demolish the north section of our neighborhood," she said. "They've already marked your house as Phase 1. Mike's grip tightened around the phone. "They know you're the last holdout," she continued. "Reynolds told the donors they'd see a 300% return once the zoning passes. And guess who introduced her? Marcus Williams." Mike could barely breathe. His house, his home. It wasn't just about his garden. They wanted everything, and they were just days away from getting it. Point 10, a showdown at the HOA meeting. It was standing room only at the HOA meeting. Mike wasn't alone this time. 60 neighbors packed the room. Even the local news station had shown up. Mrs. Reynolds tapped her microphone impatiently. First agenda item. "Actually," Mike cut in, stepping forward, holding up a thick folder. "Before we continue, I think everyone here should see this." He slapped the documents onto the table. A hush fell over the room. Property records, zoning plans, campaign donations. "This isn't about gardens," Mike said, voice steady. "It's about forcing certain people out." Mrs. Reynolds' smile tightened. "This is nonsense." "Then explain why your brother-in-law's company purchased 6 properties in our neighborhood under different LLCs," Mrs. Gonzalez said, stepping forward. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Or why Pinecrest Capital made a $225,000 donation to your campaign," added Sarah, holding up financial records. Marcus Williams stood abruptly, heading for the door. Too late. The county inspector blocked his path. "Going somewhere, Mr. Williams?" the inspector asked. "We have some questions about these zoning applications." Mrs. Reynolds' face turned ghostly white. Mike exhaled slowly. They had done it. The aftermath, a community reborn. 2 weeks later, official letters arrived at every home in Pinecrest Hills. The HOA board? Suspended. Mrs. Reynolds' campaign? Withdrawn. The zoning plan? Scrapped. But that wasn't the real victory. A year later, where one small garden stood, 37 more now bloomed. Children laughed as they ran past Mr. Abernathy's giant pumpkins. Mrs. Gonzalez's homemade salsa, made from Mike's tomatoes, won first prize at the county fair. The new neighborhood association, not an HOA, but a community-run group, met every month, not to enforce rules, but to share seeds, recipes, and stories. And as for Mrs. Reynolds, she moved away quietly. Mike sent her a basket of fresh vegetables as a parting gift, with a note. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't power. It's knowledge. And with that, he turned to his garden, his thriving, unshakable garden, and smiled, because no one could ever take it from him again. The morning after the HOA meeting, Mike expected things to quiet down. He was wrong. A sharp knock rattled his door at 6:17 a.m. A man in a suit handed him an envelope, then walked away without a word. Mike tore it open. An eviction notice. Effective immediately. His stomach dropped. Pinecrest Capital, the shell company tied to the HOA, had purchased his rental home, and now they were kicking him out. Raj stormed over when he heard. "They're trying to wipe you off the board," he fumed. Mike clenched his jaw. "They think if they remove me, they'll remove the problem." But they didn't understand. Mike wasn't the problem anymore. The entire neighborhood was awake. Strikes again. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. This wasn't just about Mike anymore. Mrs. Gonzalez, leaning on her cane, nodded toward the 3 new for sale signs that had popped up overnight. "They're moving fast," she said, "trying to finish what they started before we stopped them." Tom, the carpenter, rubbed his chin. "So we stopped them first." Sarah held up a file. "We've been digging into Pinecrest Capital. Turns out it's not even a real company, just a cover to buy properties before the rezoning vote." Mike's fist tightened. If they could prove that, the entire plan would collapse. But they needed one final piece of evidence. A direct link between the HOA, the zoning board, and the fake company. And Mrs. Reynolds was about to hand it to them. Mike's phone buzzed that evening. Mrs. Gonzalez's voice was urgent. "We have one shot at this, mijo." Mrs. Reynolds was hosting one last fundraiser before the rezoning vote. It was invitation only. A meeting of the power players. "And you're saying I should just walk in?" Mike asked. "Not you," she said. "Me." Mike's breath caught. "Mrs. Gonzalez, that's—" She cut him off. "I've lived here for 30 years. This is my home, too." There was no arguing with her. The next night, as Mrs. Reynolds' guests arrived at the Pinecrest Country Club, no one noticed a frail, elderly woman in catering staff uniform, or the tiny microphone hidden under her shawl. The next morning, the audio recording went public. Mrs. Reynolds' voice was unmistakable. "The rezoning will pass next week. Once Pinecrest Capital controls the key properties, we'll clear out the holdouts. Property values will triple. If anyone resists, well, we've handled that before." The neighborhood exploded. The story hit the local news. City Hall launched an immediate investigation. By the end of the week, white heavy checkmark, the HOA board was dissolved. White heavy checkmark, the rezoning plan was officially shut down. White heavy checkmark, Mrs. Reynolds withdrew from the city council race. And Mike, his eviction was reversed. The legal team found a loophole. Since Pinecrest Capital was fraudulent, their purchase was invalid. The original landlord agreed to reinstate his lease. Mike stepped onto his driveway, and looked out at his garden, not just as anymore, a symbol of what they had fought for. 1 year later, where one garden stood, 37 more had bloomed. Children stopped to admire Mr. Abernathy's massive pumpkins. Mrs. Gonzalez's homemade salsa, made from Mike's tomatoes, won first place at the county fair. Raj's solar panels powered the new community irrigation system. And best of all, there was no more HOA. Instead, a real neighborhood association formed, one that actually helped people instead of tearing them down. As for Mrs. Reynolds, she moved away. Quietly, Mike sent her a basket of homegrown vegetables, with a note. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't power, it's knowledge. He turned back to his garden, lush and thriving, and smiled, because no one could ever take it from him again. The end.